Howdy, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever it may be you find yourself in the world. Here we are for another part in the Etruscan Origins Series. Um, yeah, loving this series. Thanks for joining me, as always. Time is precious. Let's jump right into this article. Um, I recently did a live stream with Dr. Longo where we covered this article and much, much more, showing the correlations between the Celts, the Phoenicians, the Etruscans, and much, much more. Connecting the dot and bridging the gap between the Etruscans and the Aztecs. Big dots there. Okay. Big, big dots. More to come in that series. Me and Longo plan on getting together again and hopefully kind of finishing this off. But in this video, I wanted to correlate a specific article that we're going to cover, Ignatius Donnelly, and a book by Isaac Taylor called Etruscan Researches, where we're going to correlate some language, some mythos, and a few other things. But yeah, thanks again for joining me. And let's jump right into it. We're going to show Richmond Times Dispatch 1915. And again, the article is titled The Ancient Etruscans Mystery Solved. I'm going to go over the images. Again, if you did not see that live stream with Dr. Long, go check it out. We go into much, much more detail about many other things. But yeah, so we're going to just look at these images really fast here. Here's a fresco of a tomb of an ancient Etruscans hunting, showing their Asiatic faces. Right here is the wrap portions of the Etruscan book found at Agram and now read for the first time by Professor Jules Martha. This right here was one long, giant piece of cloth wound around a mummy. Now, this is incredibly interesting because we found mummies in American Southwest that are covered in one long piece of cloth in the exact same style with writing on the cloth in a language undecipherable. Now, could it have been Etruscan? I believe likely so. We're going to show correlations between Indian mounds, Indian burials, the Etruscans, and Finnish burials. They are nearly identical. And if you've been following along in my Anomalous America series and episode 1 Alaska, we show hundreds of mounds in Etruscan fashion found all over Alaska. So on the top here it says Etruscans taking on oath over a cup of human blood to drive out the Latin rulers of Rome. Now, the war with Rome and who Rome was. Remember, the foundations of Rome are Etruscan. Much of the ancient buildings you see in Italy, and you think of Roman and roads, walls, it's Etruscan. The outstanding sort of cyclopean fashion of Italy is Etruscan, and the later invaders just took possession. Over here, we have the mysterious face painting of Etruscan history that may be solved. On the left here, it says how shoes were made by the ancient Etruscans. Captured in the middle. After 25 years labor, a French professor reads the only known book in the Etruscan language that Rome planned to wipe out forever. We're going to correlate the Library of Alexandria and how much of that may have been an Etruscan storehouse for Atlantean culture. In one of my articles, we discussed that they were digging down through the Library of Alexandria and they found an ancient star fort. Interesting. I have also correlated much of my beliefs that the so-called French star fort were related to the Etruscans, Phoenicians, the Atlanteans, the remnants of the Atlanteans. All right, we're going to zoom in and get into this article, starting here on the left. The greatest mystery of history. The mystery of the ancient Etruscan language has been solved at last. Professor Jules Martha, a French scholar, has discovered after 20 years of patient labor the Etruscans belong to the Finnish race, originating near the Ural River in Russia, and he has read their only book from beginning to end. Much has been known about the history of the Etruscans, but their language and origin have hitherto been an unanswerable puzzle to scholars. Now, their language was buried when Rome was taken, and their people were genocided, and the few that escaped took it with them. And I believe they came back to America, where they once fled after a cataclysm. They were a powerful people occupying the center of Italy when Rome was in its infancy. They were of much higher civilization than the Romans or Latins. It's incredibly important to remember. Going back, as things get older, they become more advanced. And this relates very much so, and we're going to connect this to Atlantis. The earliest kings of Rome, including the Tarquins, were Etruscans. The earliest legends of Rome deal with the struggles of the Romans against the Etruscans. The fair Lucretia was a victim of a Tarquin who belonged to the Etruscan race. Hence the terrible enmity between the Romans and the Etruscans. When Rome overthrew the kings of the Tarquin family about 475 BC and established a republic, it meant the downfall of the Etruscans. Now, we'll get into the Tarquin family later on down this line, but it's very interesting. The Romans went to work deliberately to wipe out the memory of the Etruscan race. Every scrap of writing that could be found in the Etruscan language was destroyed, and it was forbidden to speak it under penalty of law. Now, as we get farther along in the language series, we're going to make some correlations between Turkish, Arabic, the Etruscan language, um, and how that correlates, and what Latin is, and how Latin became the kind of sacred language of the priest kings of Rome, or so-called Rome. Some 200 monuments with incomplete Etruscan inscriptions exist, but they do not form a practical basis for reading the language. Large quantities of curious Etruscan pottery and other works of art have also been preserved. Now, I've talked about this in previous episodes. We've compared the Etruscan um, pottery and shown that Greek pottery is just Etruscan pottery, and that many of the overlays between some of the quote Indians or Native Americans curiously mimic the symbols and art and patterns almost identically as the quote Etruscans. And we've also shown the correspondence between the Lydians. The Lydians were known as Minoans, or a version of the word Minoan I can't pronounce correctly, but they were Minoans, Majorca. Me and Longo have talked about the connection between them and Florida and the Gulf of Mexico quite extensively. Um, but yeah, then by a curious accident, a book in the Etruscan language was found. 20 years ago, an Austrian traveler bought an Egyptian mummy and gave it to the Museum of Agram. The linen band wound around the mummy proved to be an Etruscan book. Professor Martha went to work upon this, and by an extraordinary system of comparing the roots of all languages with the Etruscan word, succeeded in deciphering its meaning. Now, the Finnish and Phoenician phonetic correlation is key because the root is phonetic and it is Finnish. Ergo, ugro, Finnish. Hungarian's correlation here coming from the Finnish stock, the Finn. The linen band wound round the mummy proved to be, oh, sorry. He not only read the book, but revealed the meaning of all the inscriptions on Etruscan tombs in Italy. He had conquered Rome and after 2,500 years had rescued the Etruscans from the darkness in which the Romans buried them. Now, this is a story that's very old. Conquerors come in, destroy a people, genocide them, destroy all of their mythos language, often tear down structures, statues, claim what they can for themselves to be their own, and destroy whatever contradicts that. The book is a manual of navigation containing all the prayers to be offered to the gods to ensure a fair voyage. Now, that is one of the overarching ideas we've been sharing that the Phoenicians were the ancient sea people, the ancient mariners, the remnants of Atlantis. The book is, yeah, apparently the book had belonged to Etruscan sailors who, having been wrecked in Egypt, sold their book to pay their passage back. Then it had been used in embalming a mummy. The Etruscans migrated from the east in prehistoric times to Italy. In the course of their development, they underwent many influences, including that of Greece and Egypt. Now, part of this whole series is to show that that's been reversed, that they influenced Greece and Egypt, and along with, quote, Grecian and Egyptian, which are one and the same culture, or at least language, navigation, astronomy, all these things were brought from the north after a cataclysm and resulting ice age. And basically, these people were brought kind of out of the darkness from a previous age when we were all aware of this same science and we're all of a similar phenotype. Um, yeah. Their statues show them to have been an Asiatic type with almond shaped eyes and prominent cheekbones. Many of their vases are imitated from the Greek, exactly as I stated, but gone as far as to show that this is actually a reversal and that the Etruscans come before the Greeks, or the Greeks as we know them, and that the Greeks were kind of like a corrupted offshoot similar to Rome. But other objects have a character of their own. One among many interesting facts established by Professor Martha is that the Etruscans first introduced the Roman system of numbers into Europe. The Etruscans do not designate the numerals by letter of the alphabet, as do other people of ancient Semitic race. Evidence too complicated to explain fully here indicates that the Etruscans really introduced the numericals we call Roman. Roman numerals are Etruscan numerals. These figures are hieroglyphs and were invented long before the alphabetic writing, and they correlate strongly to astronomy. Another interesting observation made upon the Etruscan artistic remains is that they show a resemblance to Mexican and other early American work. This may mean that the Etruscans were in communication with America through their trade and navigation, for they were, evidently, great navigators in pre Roman times. Researches suggest that the Etruscans arrived in Italy from the east on a voyage of discovery about the year 1187 BC. They settled in the region of what is now Florence after a struggle with the Ligurians and the Umbrians. Now, Florence is incredibly interesting. Anomalous America, Arizona. I made the correlation between the the pineal gland county of Florence, Arizona, and many of the quote Italian, or as I say, Etruscan pottery symbols, Masonic symbols, language overlays, buried ancient cities of unbelievable size, and that these Etruscans had their earliest home here in America, the American Southwest. And after an incredible cataclysm, they sailed first out of the Gulf and went north, eventually um, back to the Mediterranean, or at least partially back to the Mediterranean. I believe they went many places, but that was one of them. And the story of Noah, right? Again, why it's important to um, spend some time watching my videos with Dr. Longo as we explore the connection between Noah's Ark leaving the Gulf of Mexico, right? The Noah's Ark in the Bible, the construction of the ark was from materials that strongly point to a Florida origin, and left the Gulf of Mexico and found themselves in Italy. Genoa, Janus. Janus is another name for Noah, and this deity Janus is one of the most prominent deities found in the Etruscan mythos, and also exists prominently in the Mayan and Aztec mythos as well. Back to the article. They There they found a confederation of 12 great cities long before Rome grew to importance. Now, these 12 great cities again corresponded to the 12 Roman numerals, corresponded again to the astronomical overlays. As the Finns and the Phoenicians brought astronomy, language, and mathematics to many parts of the world where they were once lost. They existed before, but were lost, I believe, due to a great cataclysm. In time, there were three Etruscan confederations of 12 cities each. Rome, a miserable village before this, became one of the cities in the last confederation formed. Two kings of the Etruscan family are of Tarquin, Servius, Tellulus, and Numa, ruled over early Rome. The older inhabitants, however, were never satisfied with their rule, and after a long series of ferocious struggles, succeeded in overturning them. The sea power of the Etruscans was definitely crushed by the Romans at Cumae in 475 AD. Yeah, so that's the ancient Etruscan mystery solved. Fantastic. We're going to do one more here. Um, really important one. There's some significance here, but not very much. There are some contradictory facts here, but we're going to go over them. So, this is a key found at last to the Etruscan language, which scientists could never read. Okay. This is going to be by a completely different individual coming to a similar conclusion. Yeah. And this is a one I haven't shared before. And we're going to look over these images real quick and then we'll jump into the article. Starting here, the inscription on this Etruscan woman's sarcophagus gives her name as Sianti Hanunia, but the word following is unknown. Down here, the Greek word triptolemos on this face gave a clue to the language of Etruria. Here in the center, writing on this queer sarcophagus in the British Museum is still a mystery. On this vase, another word, Ateion, was deciphered from this Etruscan vase. And then here, the best brains in the world of science have been unable to decipher this Etruscan writing in ancient Greek. Again, Greek coming from an older, much older language. And we're going to show the correlations here between that and Finnish, ergo Finnish, as the previous article stated here. Jumping into here. For centuries, scientists who specialize in archaeological research have been playing a crossword puzzle game of their own with the Etruscan language, which has baffled all efforts at successful deciphering. Now, a Milanese savant claims to have discovered the clue which may make the numerous records of ancient Etruria an open book. He is Professor Antonio Cavallazzi, an architect of Milan, and while he has not made public the exact nature of his discovery, he claims to have already deciphered over 100 inscriptions containing over 1,000 words. Etruria was an ancient district of Italy. Its authentic history, due to their inability of historians to read the language, is very meager and consists mainly in the story of its relations with Carthage, Greece, and Rome. Many objects found on the sites of Etruscan cities, together with certain similarities between the language of Etruria and the archaic Greeks, savours of a close connection between the two people. It had been admitted that until some scholar was fortunate enough or clever enough to hit upon the key to this dead language, the mystery of the origin of the Etruscan race is likely to remain unsolved or at best clouded in scientific conjecture. Now, this article comes before the one I had just read to you. And if you want more connections with the Gulf of Mexico and the Aztecs, you should definitely watch my 2+ hour live stream with Dr. Longo, where we cover a lot more of that. Whoever the Etruscans were, and from whatever part of the East they came, it is certain they attained a very high grade of civilization and lost their power about the time usually ascribed to the foundation of Rome, the middle of the 8th century before Christ. In view of the undecipherable nature of their language, archaeologists and historians have had to depend on their research upon the mute language of stone and terracotta sarcophagi, bronze mirrors, gems, vases, and other relics found through excavation work. Now, the terracotta connection again, it goes right to Florence, Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, just like Florence, Italy. And the bronze mirrors were prominent, and some of the most ancient ones were found in the Yucatan. The first attempt to interpret Etruscan inscriptions was made by Phil Buonarroti, a scholar of Florence in 1726. As was almost inevitable at the epoch, he tried to explain the language as a dialect of Latin. The first rational interpretation of the Etruscan alphabet is credited to Lipsius in 1841. He stated that it had 19 letters, with the following letters of the present English alphabet derived from the Latin missing: B, D, G, J, K, Q, W, and Y. This was based on a study of inscriptions found in the 3rd century BC on older monuments. K was found to occur as an archaic form of C and Q. That's incredibly important. We'll talk about that further. That's going to be a big connection with the Phoenicians, or who the Phoenicians were. The letter Q, the letter K, Kak, Ku, Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, and some more overlays with the Asur and the Assurs and the Finns. Occurred at some sort of sibilant, and S often occurred as Z. The letters B, D, and G, though they often occur in words handed down by writers as Etruscan, are never found in the Etruscan inscriptions, although there is a possibility they may have existed in the earliest forms of the Etruscan alphabet. The determination of the alphabet, vague as it was followed by a large number of attempts to explain the Etruscan forms from words in some other language to which it was supposed it might be akin. Scandinavian, Basque, and Semitic were tried among the rest. These attempts, however ingenious, all proved futile. Now, the Scandinavian and Basque roots later down the line become incredibly important because not only do they make very um, amazing correlations between the two, they show that the quote Tartar bridge between the languages was incredibly important. Not only that, the mythos and the um, astronomical presence were almost identical between the Basque, the Scandinavians, the Finns, and the Etruscans. Numerous scholars, including Professor V. Thompson, W. Corson, and W. Deek, contributed theories and deductions which tended to clarify the study for future generations, although the positive knowledge resulting from their labors was admittedly scantily. The only sound method of dealing with the unknown language is to interpret the records of the language of their own internal evidence, not by the use of imaginary parallels in better known languages, whose kinship with the problematic language is merely assumed, as in the case of the Etruscans. Now, the same people that killed the Etruscans and wiped them out were the same people that hired the mercenaries of the Helvetia region of Switzerland, who the Romans paid them to travel north to Helsinki in Finland and burn the city and kill all of its inhabitants. By this means, enough certainly has been obtained on many other characteristic features of the language to bring about a general recognition of the fact that the Etruscan is, in a sense, a Indo-European language, aside from its borrowings from the neighboring districts of Italy. Now, again, as we stated in the previous articles, it was the foundation, and they borrowed from it. And the Indo-European correlation is incredibly interesting because we're going to compare the Brahmin, the Tartar, the Druid, all these priest class were foundationally identical with the Finnish and the Etruscan. The most ambitious work ever conducted to resituate this dead language was carried on by Carl Pauli with the support of Berlin Academy. He started his monumental work in 1893 and carried it on until his death in 1901. Since then, his work has been continued by a group of notables. Pauli's research established for the first time a sound basis for the study of the inscriptions, carefully compiled and edited into a first volume, which contained over 4,000 inscriptions from the north of Etruria. The discoveries of recent years have richly increased the available material. The longest Etruscan inscription yet found is on a 5th century BC terracotta, now in the Royal Museum at Berlin. Its best preserved part contains some 200 words of continuous text divided into paragraphs. Along with the constant growth of material, some positive increase in knowledge of the language has been obtained. Professor Cavalazzi is not the first scholar to have announced the solution of the mystery of the ages. Archaeologists are waiting for their announcements, which would substantiate the claims of the professor of Milan. If this has indeed discovered the key, a word from the national, from a new historical data will at once become available. Now, I wanted to read that because it kind of shows the kind of mystery here and um, the relation again to the Latin, and that is just a mere corruption of this previous language. And now we're going to hop into Ignatius Donnelly. I'm going to read chapter 8 from his book here, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and we're going to kind of make some really cool connections here. Um, Later on in the series, we'll talk about Max Mueller and his opinions on the subject. And then we'll finish off this video with a little bit of Etruscan researches by Isaac Taylor. We'll show kind of some language overlaps. Chapter 8, The Oldest Son of Noah. That eminent authority, Dr. Max Mueller says in his lectures on the science of religion, if we confine ourselves to the Asiatic continent, with its important peninsula of Europe, we find that in the vast desert of drifting human speech, three and only three oases have been formed in which, before the beginning of all history, language became permanent and traditional. Let's see if we can just go single page here. There you go. That's a little easier to read. And we'll go back to 2 pages. Yep. Where was I? Sorry about that. Just trying to make it as clear for you guys as I can. Assumed, in fact, a new character and a character totally different from the original character of the floating and constantly varying speech of human beings. These three oases of language are known by the name of Terrarian, Aryan, and Semitic. In these three centers, more particularly in the Aryan and Semitic languages, ceased to be natural. Its growth was arrested and it became permanent, solid, petrified, or if you like, historical speech. I have always maintained that this centralization and traditional conversation of language, conversion, I apologize, of language, could only have been the result of religious and political influences. And I now mean to show that we really have a clear evidence of three independent settlements of religion: the Turanian, the Aryan, and the Semitic, concomitantly with the three great settlements of language. There can be no doubt that the Aryan, another branch which Mueller calls Semitic, but which may more properly be called Hamitic, radiated from Noah. It is a question yet to be decided whether the Turanian or Mongolian is also a branch of the Noahic or Atlantean stock. To quote again from Max Mueller, if it can only be proved that religions of the Aryan nations are united by the same bonds of a real relationship, which have enabled us to treat their language as so many varieties of the same type, and so also of the Semitic, the field thus opened is vast enough, and its careful clearing and cultivation will occupy several generations of scholars. And their original relationship, I believe, can be proved. Names of the principal deities, words also expressive of the most essential elements of religion, such as prayer, sacrifice, altar, spirit, law, and faith, have been preserved among the Aryan and among the Semitic nations, and these relics admit of one explanation only. After that, a comparative study of the Turanian religions may be approached with better hope of success, for that there was not only a primitive Aryan and a primitive Semitic religion, but likewise a primitive Turanian religion before each of these primeval races was broken up and became separated in language, worship, and national sentiment. Admits, I believe, of little doubt. There was a period during which the ancestors of the Semitic family had not yet been divided, whether in language or in religion. That period transcends the recollection of every one of the Semitic races in the same way as neither Hindus, Greeks, nor Romans have any recollection of the time when they spoke a common language and worshipped their Father in heaven by the name that was as yet neither Sanskrit nor Greek nor Latin. But I do not hesitate to call this prehistoric period historical in the best sense of the word. It was a real period because unless it was real, all the realities of the Semitic languages and the Semitic religions, such as we find them after their separation, would be unintelligible. Now, this is important because this is very much correlated with the fall of the Tower of Babel. Was that the great mother tree? I don't know, but they're definitely related. Where was I? Hebrew, Syriac, and Arabic point to a common source as much as Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. And unless we can bring ourselves to doubt that the Hindus and the Greeks, the Romans, and the Teutons derived the worship of their principal deity from their common Aryan sanctuary, We shall not be able to deny that there was likewise a primitive religion of the whole Semitic race, and that El, the strong one in heaven, was invoked by the ancestors of all the Semitic races before there was Babylonians in Babylon, Phoenicians in Sidon and Tyrus, before there were Jews in Mesopotamia or Jerusalem. The evidence of the Semitic is the same as that out of the Aryan languages. The conclusion cannot be different. These three classes of religion are not to be mistaken as little as the three classes of language, the Terrarian, the Semitic, and the Aryan. They mark three events in the most ancient history of the world, events which have determined the whole fate of the human race, and which we ourselves still feel the consequences in our language, in our thoughts, and in our religion. Now, in our thoughts is really important. If you've been following me for a while, you've heard me talk about Julian Jaynes and the breakdown of the bicameral mind, that through some event in human history, perhaps a cataclysm, the human brain was augmented into two halves. The subconscious and the conscious became separate of sorts. And that before this era, you had a sort of human being hearing voices. It's kind of schizophrenic. They had no analog eye. They had no conception of themselves and had no inner dialogue, but instead were receiving auditory hallucinations that they called God. So I believe the splitting of these languages, the Tower of Babel, the fall, the exiting of the Garden of Eden being the age of innocence, being the age where there was no inner self, there was no analog eye, and everyone was being directed kind of like ants in a colony. No one was making their own decisions and living their own life and having free will. And that through this separation and the fall of the tower, the splitting of the hemispheres, the creation of the inner dialogue of the subconscious mind, and all of these things are interconnected. We have seen that all the evidence point to the fact that this original seat of the Phoenician Hebrew family was in Atlantis. The great god of the so-called Semites was El, the strong one, for whose name comes the biblical names Beth El, the house of God, Ha El, the strong one, Elohim, the gods, Eloah, God, and from the same name is derived the Arabian name of God, Allah. Now, Allah, yeah, we'll show more correlations between this and the Finnish. Another evidence of the connection between the Greeks, Phoenician Hebrews, and Atlanteans is shown in the name Adonis. The Greeks tell us that Adonis was the lover of Aphrodite, or Venus, who was the offspring of Uranus. She came out of the sea. Uranus was the father of Kronos and the grandfather of Poseidon, king of Atlantis. Now we find Adonai in the Old Testament used exclusively as the name of Jehovah, while among the Phoenicians, Adonai was the supreme deity. In both cases, the root ad is probably reminiscent of Atlantis. There seem to exist similar connections between Egyptian and the Turanian mythologies. The great god of Egypt was Neph, or Num, the chief god of the Samodes is Num. Now, the Samodes in correlation with the Finns very much. And Max Mueller established as an identity between none of the Samodes and the god Yuma Allah of the Finns, and probably with the name of god Nam of the Tibetans. Absolutely. That mysterious people, the Etruscans, who inhabited part of Italy and whose bronze implements agreed exactly in style and workmanship with those which we think were derived from Atlantis, were, it is now claimed, a branch of the Turanian family. At a recent meeting of the English Philological Society, great interest was excited by a paper on Etruscan numerals. Now, remember, we were talking about in the previous article about Roman numerals being Etruscan numerals by Reverend Isaac Taylor. Again, Isaac Taylor, we're going to get into a bit of his research next. He stated that the long sought key to the Etruscan language had at last been discovered. Two dice had been found in a tomb with their six faces marked with the words instead of pips. He showed that these words were identical with the first six digits in the Altaic branch of the Turanian family of speech. Guided by this clue, it was easy to prove that the grammar and vocabulary of the 3,000 Etruscan inscriptions were also Altaic. The words denoting kindred, the pronouns, the conjugations, and the declinations corresponded closely to those of the Tartar tribes of Siberia. The Etruscan mythology proved to be essentially the same as that of the Kalevala, the great Finnic epic. Unbelievable paragraph, and Isaac Taylor is spot on here. Now, the Tartar tribes of Siberia, that's incredibly important. Um, Big correlations, right? In these kind of whole Tartaria movement that we're dealing with, Phoenician, post Ice Age races moving from the north downward, bringing with them um, language, astronomy, um, cultivation, you name it. I could read this whole paragraph, but for the sake of time, we won't. I'll get into Ignatius Donnelly much, much more down the line. We'll read the next two paragraphs and then we'll move on to a little Isaac Taylor. According to Lenormant, Ancient History of the East, the early contests between the Aryans and the Turanians are represented in the Iranian traditions as contest between hostile brothers. The Ergo-Finnish races must, accordingly to all appearances, be looked upon as a branch, earlier detached than the others from the Japhetic stem. If it be true that the first branch originating from Atlantis was the Turanian, which includes the Chinese and Japanese, then we have derived from Atlantis all the building and metalworking races of men who have proved themselves capable of civilization. Now, we're also going to show that pre the rearranging of the Chinese language, that it also was ergo Finnish, of course, because the Siberia connection and the Tartars, you can see the roots there. Not to mention the astronomy is almost identical. And the language, and the Japanese language, is incredibly similar, even phonetically and speech, to the Finnish of today. And we may therefore divide mankind into two great classes: those capable of civilization, derived from Atlantis, and those essentially and at all times barbarian, who hold no blood relationship with the people of Atlantis. And this is an overarching story that you find with these people who these mariners, these ancient mariners, visiting all these cultures who had no language, had no understanding of mathematics, numerals, any of that being it brought to them. Again, this cataclysm being the separation, and idol worship and stone worship, and many of these things being correlated to these lost people now no longer hearing their inner dialogue or their inner guidance. Their kind of schism had broke, and they were now had free will. And I think this is directly related to the Tower of Babel and the fall of Atlantis. But yeah, let's hop over to Isaac Taylor. I just want to touch on a few pages here. Again, we'll get into this whole book eventually, and that'll be a much longer video. I wanted to keep this under 45 minutes, and we're pretty close. So, okay, where to start? I thought I had it ready to go here, but it looks like it didn't. I apologize. Give me 1 second. I want to line this up here. Um, hmm. Okay, we're just going to start with right here. The name Sharu or Sharun is commonly affixed to one of these demons. He is not altogether the same as Charon of the Greeks, who attributes were probably borrowed partially from Egypt and partially from Etruria. Sharu is armed sometimes with the oar or rudder, as a sign of his office of infernal ferryman, but more frequently he carries uplifted a ponderous hammer, evidently an instrument of torture. He is represented as revolting in appearance, and he is often distinguished by Negro features and complexion. In the whole Etruscan mythology, there are few representations that occur more universally than this hideous demon with the hammer. This being the case, is more worthy of note than they were able to recognize the same personage in the beliefs which prevail among the Siberian tribes. Pokoki, the Oriental traveler, tells that the Turkic tribes, which he visited a century and a half ago, had a curious superstition. They believe that two black demons dwell in the sepulchre of the dead, and if he be found guilty of any crime, they punish him with hammers. Unfortunately, Pokoki does not mention the name of these demons, but the black complexion, the hammer, and the office agree so precisely with the representations of the Etruscan Sharu that we can hardly refuse to admit the identification. Moreover, the myth of the journey of souls across the river of death and the office of the infernal ferryman are both found in the Kalevala. The river Styx exists. It's a prominent feature, and it's all over Egyptian mythology, um, Phoenician, Finnish, um, you know, Hungarian, yeah, all the way into the Siberian tribes and the Tartars. The name Sharan may be explained from Ugric sources. The suffix "un" occurs repeatedly in the names of Etruscan deities and is probably in a branded form of Iana, a spirit or a jinn god. The first syllable of the name be either the Turkic "kara," black, or it may be from a root which denotes an ore or a river. A river is Shur in Wotiak, Skor in Zeranian, Kai in Samode, Chor in Lesgi, and Agur Su equals water in Turkic. And Or is Kiurkic in Turkish and Kurnak in Koibal Tartar. Tarun would thus mean either the black spirit or the ferryman. In addition to the malevolent demons, we find two attempts of the departed soul who are of the gentle aspect and milder nature. They seem to be discerning or recording fates, bear the names of Lhasa and Min. They are represented with stylus and paper, and according to the Egyptian monuments and judgments pronounced against the deceased. Lhasa perhaps means the gentle one. In Wogol, Las and Lasi mean gentle, slow, and in Hungarian, Lhasa and Lasan had the same meaning. Among the Samodes and also among the Ostiaks, Losi, Las, Luso, Lus, Lo, Lok are either worshipped as guardian deities or as regarded as serviceable spirits ready to do the bidding of the shaman. But as Christianity and Mohammedanism have advanced, the usual result has followed. The gods of the earlier creed become the devils of the successor. Thus, in Ionesi, Lutz means the devil, and Samo, the word Luz is the same signification. The Turkish phonetic equivalent of the Finnic L is J. The word Lhasa would therefore become Jaza. And the Turkish dictionary gives the word Jeza with the significance of judgment or retribution. This sense brings us near the Chinese Le, fate, which is probably the original source of the Etruscan Lhasa. Again, making the bridge between the old Chinese before it was rewritten by the British. Really important, and we'll get into that more. Now I want to jump ahead. The remarkable name Mean, which so unmistakably connects the Etruscan pantheon with the mythology of the Kalevala, contains the same root as the names Manes, Mania, Mantis. The names may be conveniently discussed together. The Manes were the deified spirits of the dead, the worshipped of ancestral spirits under the name of Manes, Lairs, and the Murs. Now, this is an interesting one because if you've been watching my member series on Lemuria, we discussed the roots of the name Lemuria and how it means the fallen spirits or the spirits that have been washed away. Funny connection with Lemuria and it being a sunken continent. Now, it also shows a kind of Finnish Atlantis type of mythos and an overlay with the Finnish language as well as the Etruscan, who, again, the Etruscans talk about coming from a sunken land. Uh, Again, for the sake of time, I am jumping ahead a little bit. So if you really enjoy this book here, let me know in the comments, and I will do a entire episode on this book. For it's very very fantastic. And like I said, here are the titles up here: Etruscan Researches by Isaac Taylor on archive.gov. You can look this up. And if you aren't familiar with Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly, also on archive.org, I suggest you read them. They're amazing. We have just seen that in the mythology of the Kalevala, the ruler of the land of the dead was called Mana. Now, this is really interesting, you guys, because Mana correlates with Wakanda. Okay. And Mana, Wakanda, has so many overlays between so many languages. It's unbelievable. This words mean under the earth or belonging to the earth. being the locative or possessive case of ma, a word which means the earth, ma, in all the Finnic languages. From mana, we get manala, the underworld, literally, the place of mana, and manales, the people of the underworld, which is the chief name given in the Kalevala to the spirits of the departed. The Monolist of the Kalevala are to be identified with the manes of the Romans and the Etruscans. Mantus, the Etruscan despiter, seems to be the father of the manes, the T being derivable from the Turkic ata, father. The Urgic roots which underline all of these words is of vast antiquity, anterior to the first separation of the Turanian family. This appears from the fact that the ancient Egyptian name for the kingdom of the dead was Amenti, a word radically identical with the Manala of the Finnic Kalevala, the realm of the Etrusca Romo Montes, and of the Cretan Minos. Uniting these long separated fragments of the Turanian Cretan speech, we see that the underworld, Amenti, or Manala, was inhabited by the Manes, or Manalis, the souls of the departed, who were the children of Mania, and were ruled over by Mantus, the king of souls. We're going to jump ahead some more. This is an incredibly important part here, and one of the main reasons why I wanted to attach this to this presentation here. We're at 46 minutes, so I'll make this fast. The analogies of this characteristic word are not far to seek. The Albanian language has preserved many elements of the neighboring Etruscan speech, and there can be little doubt that the Albanian word, which means high, magnificent, is identical with the Etruscan larthi. If the word be translated into Urgic form, we would expect the L becoming a J or a DJ. This phonetic law enables us to recognize the Etruscan word lar in the Somgetic yeru, lar yeru, which means lord, master, or prince. In the Tai Gi, which is a dialect of the southern branch of the Samodes, we find the form yar with the same meaning. This brings us to the title of the Russian emperor, Tsar, an appellation which is doubtless of Tartaric origin. In the Finnic languages, we find the same root, sar, sir, meaning high, and sir, great. While in the Hungarian, we have the abraded for a lord. The supreme god of the Lapps is Hermes. Hermes. You see this here? The supreme god of Lapps is Hermes. Now, remember my work on the Thoth, the Atlantean. Big correlation. The lofty one, a name identical with the Estonian Tara, God, and the Wogel, Tarum, heaven. Saraka, the ancient lady, is the name of the tutelary deity whose images are used by the Lapps to protect their flocks from evil. Now, this is incredibly important because we correlate Sar with Khan, Khan of the Tartars, and Khan, Caan of the Aztecs and the Mayans. Now, the terms for Lord and King and High and Great come from the Finnic or Phoenician root, showing that the priest class of all these different cultures come from the same title, the same root. Incredibly important. So Sar is Lar, is Tar, is Sir, Sir, yes, Sir, Tara, Khan, the same. And I'm going to end it with this right here. So you can pause and look this over. The correlation between the supreme deities of the Etruscan with their nearest Aryan equivalents were as follows. You can pause on this page and read the rest of this. These Etruscan names can be traced in the Ugaric mythologies, and their meaning can be explained from the Ugaric languages. Though the names given to the supreme deity by the Turanian nations differ widely in form, they are ultimately reducible to the same elements, and all testify to the same primitive objects of worship. The Turanian and the Iranian mythologies agree in this. All the supreme deities resolve themselves ultimately into chief celestial phenomenon: the dawn, the sky, the sun, and the thunder. The Semitic nations, on the other hand, have from the earliest times shown themselves capable of a far higher conception of deity than the mere nature of worship or others. Here's kind of your segregation away from monotheism and paganism. Okay. It starts here with the Semitic tribes. With them, God was the ruler. They worshipped El the Mighty, Adonis, the Lord, Moloch the King, Rimmon the Exalted. Their supreme deity was power. The names of the chief Turanian deities are derived from two principal roots: ten, high, still, to pierce. The first root explains the names of the sky gods and the thunder gods. The second explains the names of the sun gods. Yeah. So again, let me know in the comments if you want me to do deeper dives on Ignatius Donnelly and Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, as well as this book, Etruscan Researches by Isaac Taylor. They're both fantastic. They're very long reads, so we could just pick and choose. You could ask for specific things, but this here is really important. And for those of you interested in these deity overlays, they're really quite amazing. The Aser and the gods. Whew. There's so much here, but yeah. So again, 51 minutes. Appreciate you all very much. Um, yeah, thanks for sticking with me for Etruscan Origins Series, Mysteries Solved, showing the correlation between the Etruscans, the Phoenicians, the Finnish, and connecting the dots back to America, which is kind of what we're trying to do here with the Atlantis and Lemuria stuff and much more. So, yeah, more to come in this series. Um, Again, thanks for being here. Have a wonderful day. Bye, guys.